Today, at 60 years old, I look back on the last 27 years, and I can't help but wonder if I made the right choice. It all started with a single night that changed everything. A night when I found an injured creature out there in the woods. A creature the world calls Bigfoot, but I call family. I'm sharing this story now because after all these years, I think it's time to face the truth. What we learned from each other is more shocking than anything I could have imagined. My name is Michael Carter, and in the fall of 1998, I was a forest ranger stationed in the remote backcountry of Washington State, about 40 miles northeast of Mount Rainier. I was 33 years old then, living alone in a cabin that had belonged to my late wife's grandfather. She had passed away 2 years earlier, and I'd chosen this assignment specifically for its isolation. Out there, checking trap cameras and monitoring elk populations, I didn't have to explain to anyone why I sometimes went 3 days without speaking a word. It was October 17, 1998. I remember the date because it was a Friday, and the radio had been playing Aerosmith's "I Don't Want to Miss a Thing" all week long. The temperature had dropped to about 38 degrees after sunset, and I was making my usual evening patrol around the northern boundary of my territory. The Douglas firs were so thick in that area that my flashlight beam only penetrated maybe 20 feet before getting swallowed by the darkness. I was checking the game trail markers near Cascade Creek when I heard it. Not an animal sound. It was too controlled for that, too purposeful. A low, guttural moan that rose and fell like someone trying to form words through clenched teeth. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I'll admit, my first thought was that someone had gotten hurt, maybe fallen from the ridge above. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there need help?" The sound stopped immediately. Complete silence. Even the usual nighttime chorus of insects seemed to hold its breath. I moved toward where I'd heard it, my maglite sweeping back and forth across the undergrowth. The beam caught something reflective about 30 yards ahead, 2 points of light at roughly 7 feet off the ground. Too high for a deer, too far apart for a cougar. "I'm a forest ranger," I called out. "I'm here to help if you're injured." The lights blinked. That's when I realized they weren't lights at all. They were eyes, catching my flashlight beam and throwing it back at me. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But my training kicked in. I'd dealt with bears, mountain lions, even a few aggressive elk during rutting season. I kept my light steady and moved closer, one hand near the bear spray on my belt. The beam finally revealed what was watching me. It was crouched behind a massive fallen cedar, one of those ancient trees that takes 3 men with linked arms to circle. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the head too large and flat compared to any bear I'd ever encountered. Dark fur covered every visible inch except for the face, which was leathery and creased, almost human, but not quite. The eyes were deep brown, ringed with what looked like exhaustion or pain, and one leg was twisted underneath it at an angle that made my stomach turn. The creature, because I didn't have another word for it then, made that sound again. That low moan. But this time, I heard what I'd missed before. It wasn't aggression. It was a plea. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. My mind was racing through impossibilities. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? The Patterson-Gimlin film I'd seen on a documentary years ago. All the jokes and tabloid covers and late-night radio shows. But here was something real, something hurt, something looking at me with an intelligence I couldn't deny. The creature tried to move, and I saw the bone, white against the dark fur, protruding from its left leg just above what would be its ankle. It made another sound, softer this time, and its right hand, because I couldn't call it anything else, reached toward the injury as if to touch it, but stopped short. I made my decision in that moment. I don't know if it was the right one. I've questioned it 10,000 times since. But looking into those eyes, seeing the fear and pain there, I knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't report this, because reporting it would mean hunters, scientists, people with tranquilizer guns, and specimen containers. It would mean taking this creature out of the only home it had ever known and turning it into an exhibit. "Easy there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. You have to understand why I did what I did. It wasn't just about the creature in that moment. It was about everything that had led me to that remote cabin in the first place." When Sarah died in the summer of 1996, I stopped recognizing the man in the mirror. We'd been married for 8 years. She was a teacher, loved hiking, wanted to start a family. Then one day she complained of a headache, and 3 months later, a brain tumor took her from me. She was 31 years old. I couldn't stay in Seattle after that. Couldn't walk past the coffee shop where we'd met. Couldn't drive down our street without expecting to see her car in the driveway. When the Forest Service offered me this position, maintaining a 40-square-mile tract of wilderness that saw maybe 3 visitors a year, I took it without hesitation. Sarah's family had kept this old cabin up here, built by her grandfather in the 1960s. They offered it to me, and I moved in with nothing but a truck full of supplies and a desperate need to be somewhere she'd never been, somewhere that didn't echo with her absence. So when I found that creature, broken and terrified in the October darkness, maybe I saw something in it I recognized. Something that needed protecting, something vulnerable in a world that wouldn't understand. I spent that entire first night figuring out how to help it. I couldn't move something that size, not with a compound fracture like that. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to my cabin, grabbed my first aid supplies, some pain medication meant for emergencies, and a tarp. I soaked a cloth in water mixed with codeine, the strong stuff I'd been prescribed after a logging accident the year before, but never used. When I got back, the creature was still there. It watched me approach with those intelligent eyes, tracking every movement. I held up the cloth where it could see it, then slowly, carefully, brought it within reach. The creature's hand, and I have to keep calling it that because that's exactly what it was, complete with opposable thumb and individual fingers the size of sausages, reached out and took the cloth from me. It sniffed it first. Then, to my amazement, it pressed the cloth against its leg wound. I spent the next 4 hours there, slowly earning enough trust to get closer. By the time the sun started to lighten the eastern sky, I'd managed to set the bone using a technique I'd learned during my EMT training. The creature never tried to hurt me. It flinched, it made sounds that were clearly pain, but it let me work. As dawn broke fully on October 18, 1998, I made a shelter using the tarp and some deadfall. The creature crawled under it, and I watched as it finally closed its eyes. I stumbled back to my cabin as the Forest Service radio crackled to life with the morning check-in. I responded mechanically, confirmed I was alive and well, and reported nothing unusual. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at my hands, which were covered in coarse, dark hair from the creature's fur. That's when I started planning. The old tool shed about 200 yards from my cabin and completely hidden by a thick stand of cedars had been empty for years. It was solid, built to withstand the harsh winters, with a dirt floor and walls thick enough to provide insulation. Over the next 3 days, while the creature recovered under that tarp, I transformed the shed. I brought in old blankets, cleared out decades of accumulated junk, and created what I convinced myself was a temporary sanctuary. On the 4th night, the creature moved. It limped, putting only minimal weight on the injured leg, but it moved, and it followed me back to the shed. I named it Shadow that night, watching it disappear into the darkness of the shed's interior, barely visible even with my flashlight pointed directly at it. The name felt right. This creature was a shadow, something that existed just outside the light of human understanding. The bone took 6 weeks to heal. I know because I checked it every 3 days, amazed at how quickly the creature's body repaired itself. By late November, Shadow was putting full weight on the leg. By early December, the limp was barely noticeable. But Shadow didn't leave. Every morning, I'd bring food. Deer meat from my freezer, salmon I'd caught and smoked that summer, berries and nuts I'd collected. Shadow ate everything, watching me with what I can only describe as curiosity. And every evening, just after sunset, Shadow would emerge from the shed and stand at the tree line, looking out at the forest. Then, like clockwork, it would return to the shed before dawn. I told myself this was temporary, that once Shadow was fully healed, it would return to wherever it came from. But weeks turned into months, and Shadow stayed. The winter of 1998 into 1999 was one of the harshest on record. Mount Rainier got hit with over 1,100 inches of snow that season, and my little corner of the wilderness wasn't much better. The temperature dropped below zero for 2 straight weeks in January. I worried constantly about Shadow, but every morning when I checked the shed, it was there, seemingly unbothered by the cold. That thick fur was better insulation than anything humans had invented. It was during that winter that I realized Shadow wasn't just surviving. It was communicating. I'd been talking to Shadow from the beginning, mostly one-sided conversations while I worked around the shed or brought food. "Morning, big guy. Got some venison here for you. Fresh snow last night, about 8 inches. That sort of thing. It helped with the loneliness, if I'm being honest. But sometime around February of 1999, Shadow started responding. Not with words, but with sounds that weren't random. When I'd arrive at the shed, Shadow would make a low rumbling sound, almost like a cat's purr, but deeper, resonating in my chest. When I'd leave, a different sound, higher pitched, questioning. And one day, when I dropped the bucket of food and cursed under my breath, Shadow made a sound that I could have sworn was mimicking my tone. I started testing it. I'd knock on the shed door before entering. 3 knocks, always the same pattern. Within a week, Shadow was knocking back, 3 times from inside. By the time spring arrived in 1999, we had a whole vocabulary of sounds and gestures. Shadow would indicate hunger by touching its stomach, thirst by gesturing toward its mouth. When something was wrong, when Shadow heard something concerning in the forest, it would make a specific clicking sound and point in that direction. I'd never felt so connected to another being since Sarah died. But that connection came with a price. On a Saturday in April 1999, 2 hikers showed up at my cabin. They were lost, turned around on one of the unmarked trails, and needed directions back to the main road. Simple enough? Except while I was giving them directions, Shadow made that rumbling sound from the direction of the shed. The hikers heard it. "What was that?" the woman asked, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "Black bear," I said without hesitation. "Got a juvenile that's been hanging around, already called it into wildlife management. They're going to relocate it next week." It was the first of many lies, and it came so easily that it scared me. The summer of 2000 brought new challenges. Shadow started getting restless at night. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and see it standing at the tree line, that massive silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Shadow would stay there for hours, just watching the forest, before returning to the shed by dawn. I wondered if Shadow was lonely, if there were others out there, if I was keeping it from its real family. Then came July 16th, 2000. I'll never forget that date because it was the day I realized how intelligent Shadow really was. I'd been working on fixing a section of fence near the shed when I heard a truck engine in the distance. Vehicles were rare out here, usually only Forest Service rangers doing their rounds. But this was a Sunday, and we didn't have rounds scheduled. I hurried back toward my cabin and saw a white Ford F-150 parked in my clearing. 2 men in hunting gear were examining the area. I recognized them, local guides who led hunting expeditions in the area. They nodded as I approached. "Michael Carter?" the older one, Don Phillips, asked. "That's right." "We've been hired to track something in this area. Large animal, possibly a bear. Client says he saw something unusual on his last trip up here. Wanted us to check it out. My blood ran cold. Haven't seen anything unusual, just the regular wildlife. Mind if we look around? I did mind, but I couldn't say that. Sure, but stay clear of the eastern perimeter. Got some equipment stored there that's Forest Service property. They agreed and spent 2 hours walking my territory. I shadowed them the whole time, my heart pounding every time they got near the shed. Shadow must have heard them because there wasn't a single sound from that direction. After they left, I went to check on Shadow. It was pressed against the back wall of the shed, completely still. When I entered, Shadow looked at me and made a sound I'd never heard before. A low, worried vocalization that rose at the end, like a question. "I know," I whispered. "We have to be more careful." Shadow reached out and touched my shoulder, gently, carefully, the way you'd comfort a frightened child. In that moment, I understood. Shadow knew. It understood the danger those men represented, and it was trying to comfort me. That night, I started planning better security. Motion sensors, better locks on the shed, a story that would hold up under more scrutiny. By the fall of 2001, I'd become paranoid. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every visitor to my cabin felt like a threat. I'd lost 15 pounds and wasn't sleeping more than 4 hours a night. The Forest Service supervisor, Jack Brennan, noticed during his quarterly visit. "You doing okay out here, Carter?" he asked. "You look rough." "Just the isolation," I said. "Been thinking about maybe rotating back to a station with more people." "Probably a good idea. This place can get to you. Let me know if you need to talk to anyone. We've got counselors available." I never made that rotation because the thought of leaving Shadow, of putting it at risk by abandoning my post, was worse than the paranoia. The spring of 2002 brought the first real close call. Shadow had been getting braver about leaving the shed at night. I'd wake up and find it gone, returning just before dawn with pine needles stuck in its fur and the smell of the deep forest on it. I worried, but I couldn't keep Shadow locked up. It wasn't a prisoner, it was choosing to stay, and I had to respect that freedom. But on March 28, 2002, Shadow didn't come back. I waited until noon, then started searching. I found tracks heading northwest toward Cascade Creek, large depressions in the soft earth at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. I followed them for 3 miles until I heard voices. A group of college students on a biology field trip were examining something near the creek. As I got closer, I saw what they were looking at. Shadow's tracks, fresh ones. "Those are the biggest bear prints I've ever seen," one student said. Their professor, a woman in her 50s, was taking photographs. "These aren't bear tracks," she said slowly. "Look at the shape. 5 toes, like a bear, but the stride length is wrong. And this heel impression, it's almost plantigrade, like a primate." I had to intervene. "Those are grizzly tracks," I said loudly as I approached. "We've got a big male that roams this territory. I've been tracking him for 2 years. You folks need to head back to the main trail. Grizzlies are unpredictable this time of year." The professor looked skeptical but nodded. "We're with Western Washington University. Would you be willing to talk to us about the wildlife in this area?" "Can't right now. Need to make sure that bear hasn't gotten into any campsites. Give me your email and I'll send you some information." I never sent that email, but I did spend the rest of that day covering Shadow's tracks and praying it would come back. It did, just after midnight. I heard that rumbling sound outside my cabin and rushed out to find Shadow standing there, looking directly at me. In its hand was a cluster of wild huckleberries, still on the branch. Shadow held them out to me. It was the first gift, the first time Shadow had brought me something instead of the other way around. I took the berries, and for the first time in 6 years, I cried, not from fear or stress or paranoia, but from the sheer impossibility of what was happening. This creature, this thing that wasn't supposed to exist, was showing me kindness. The years started blending together after that. 2003, 2004, 2005. Each one brought new patterns, new communications, new risks. In the summer of 2003, Shadow started drawing. I'd given it an old pencil, mostly as a joke, and Shadow examined it for hours. The next day, I found crude markings on the shed wall, circles, lines, shapes that almost looked like trees. I brought more pencils and paper. Shadow's drawings became more complex. Trees, definitely, and two figures, one large, one small, standing together. By 2004, I realized Shadow understood more English than I'd thought possible. I'd say things like, "I need to go check the northern boundary," and Shadow would point north. Or, "There's a storm coming," and Shadow would gesture to the shed, to shelter. The autumn of 2005 brought another hunter scare. Two men showed up claiming they'd seen something large and bipedal crossing Route 410. They'd tracked it to within 5 miles of my cabin. I told them it was probably a man in a costume, some prankster who got his kicks scaring tourists. They didn't fully believe me, but they moved on. That night, I sat Shadow down in the shed. "We can't keep doing this," I said. "Someone's going to find out eventually, and when they do, they won't understand. They'll be afraid." Shadow made a sound. Then it did something it had never done before. It spoke, not clearly, not perfectly, but unmistakably. A single word, rough and guttural, but absolutely intentional. "Stay." I stared at it, speechless. Shadow reached out and touched my chest. "Stay," it repeated. I realized then that Shadow had been learning, not just gestures and sounds, but actual words. How long had it been able to do this? How much more could it understand? "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, we'll figure it out. Together." The winter of 2006 into 2007 was when everything changed again. Shadow got sick, not injured, not hurt, but genuinely ill. It developed a fever, its eyes became unfocused, and it stopped eating for 3 days. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't take it to a vet. I couldn't call a doctor. So I did what I could with my limited medical knowledge and a lot of prayer. I stayed in that shed for 4 days straight, monitoring Shadow's temperature, forcing water down its throat, keeping it warm. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Shadow opened its eyes and looked at me and made that rumbling sound I'd come to associate with contentment or gratitude. When Shadow recovered fully about 2 weeks later, our relationship was different, deeper. Shadow would sit with me while I worked, not just near me, but next to me, sometimes so close our shoulders touched. Shadow would reach out and touch my hand when I looked worried. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Shadow would make sounds that were almost like singing. Low, melodic vocalizations that echoed through the forest and made the hair on my arms stand up in wonder. By 2008, I'd been keeping this secret for nearly 10 years. The weight of it had become part of who I was. I'd stopped connecting with other people entirely. When I went into town for supplies, maybe once every 2 months, I felt like an alien. People would try to make small talk, and I'd fumble through it, desperate to get back to my cabin. Back to the only relationship that felt real anymore. My sister called that year, first time in 3 years. "Michael, I'm worried about you," she said. "When was the last time you came home? When was the last time you talked to anyone from Sarah's family?" "I'm fine," I told her. "Just busy with work." "You're not fine. You're hiding. It's been 12 years since Sarah died, and you're still hiding." She was right, of course, but I couldn't explain that I wasn't hiding from Sarah's memory anymore. I was protecting something far more important. The years 2009 and 2010 passed in a strange routine. Shadow was fully integrated into my life now. We had patterns, rhythms. I'd bring food every morning at 7:30. We'd spend the midday hours together, sometimes with me reading aloud from old books while Shadow listened, its head tilted in that gesture of attention I'd learned to recognize. In the evenings, Shadow would venture into the forest, and I'd wait, always wait, until I heard that rumbling sound announcing its return. Shadow's vocabulary grew. By 2010, it could say maybe 20 words. Stay. Food, water, cold, danger, each one pronounced in that rough, deep voice, but unmistakable. And Shadow understood far more than it could say. I'd have entire one-sided conversations, and Shadow would respond with gestures or sounds that showed it comprehended every word. In March of 2011, Shadow showed me something that changed everything again. We were walking, something we'd started doing together in the deep woods, where no one ever went. Shadow stopped suddenly and pointed to a tree. There, about 8 feet up, were carvings, fresh ones, not made by tools, but by something sharp, maybe claws or a tough branch. The carvings were symbols, a circle with lines radiating from it, several trees in a cluster, and in the center, 2 figures holding hands. Shadow had made these, had been making them for who knows how long, and they told a story. Shadow's story and mine. "Is this us?" I asked, pointing to the 2 figures. Shadow nodded. It had learned that gesture from me years ago and now used it fluently. "There are more," I said. "More like you, out there somewhere." Shadow made a sound. Sad, I thought. Lonely. Then it pointed to me and made the sound for stay. Pointed to the forest and made a different sound. One I didn't recognize, but I understood the meaning. Shadow had chosen me over them. The guilt hit me hard. "You should be with your own kind," I said. "Not here with me." Shadow shook its head. Then it did something extraordinary. It knelt down, bringing itself to my eye level, and placed one massive hand on my shoulder. "Family," it said. That word broke something open in my chest. For the first time since Sarah died, I felt like I belonged somewhere, but the outside world wouldn't leave us alone. In June of 2012, a documentary film crew showed up in the area. They were doing a show about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest for the Discovery Channel. They interviewed me for about 10 minutes, asking if I'd ever seen anything unusual. "Just bears and elk," I lied smoothly. "Bigfoot's a myth. Good for tourism, though." They left, but their presence made me nervous. The area was getting more attention. Hiking trails were being improved. Cell phone towers were going up. The isolation I'd relied on for over a decade was slowly disappearing. By 2015, I was 48 years old and felt like I'd lived 3 lifetimes. Shadow was aging too. That thick, dark fur now had streaks of gray, particularly around the face and shoulders. Shadow moved more slowly in the mornings, and the nighttime forest excursions became less frequent. We'd settled into something like an old married couple, comfortable silences, shared meals, an understanding that transcended language. That year, I finally told Shadow the truth about why I was here, about Sarah, about the grief that had driven me into these woods. We were sitting by the creek, the one where I'd first found Shadow's tracks all those years ago. I talked for over an hour, and Shadow listened. When I finished, Shadow reached out and touched my wedding ring. I'd never taken it off. "Gone," Shadow said quietly. "Yes, gone." Shadow made a sound, then another word I'd taught it. "Sorry." We sat there together until the sun went down, 2 beings who had no business being in each other's lives, bound by something I still don't fully understand. The winter of 2017 brought the worst crisis since that day with the college students. A group of Bigfoot hunters, actual organized researchers with thermal imaging and drones, set up a base camp just 8 miles from my cabin. They were there for 3 weeks, searching the forest systematically. I couldn't risk Shadow leaving the shed during that time. For 21 days, Shadow was confined to that space, and I could see it taking a toll. Shadow became restless, pacing, making anxious sounds. On the 18th day, Shadow looked at me and said, "Outside." "Not yet," I said. "It's not safe." "Outside," Shadow repeated, more insistent. I know, just a few more days." Shadow sat down heavily and made a sound I'd never heard before. A keening, mournful cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. And I realized I'd become Shadow's jailer, not its protector. When the researchers finally left, I opened the shed door. Shadow emerged slowly, blinking in the bright March sunlight, and stood there for a long moment. Then it walked past me without a sound and disappeared into the forest. For 3 days, Shadow didn't come back. I thought I'd lost it, that I'd pushed too hard, kept too tight a grip, and driven away the only real connection I'd had in 20 years. But on the 4th morning, I heard that rumbling sound. Shadow was back, standing at the tree line with a gift, a small carved piece of wood, roughly shaped like a bird in flight. I took it, and Shadow touched my hand. "Family," it said again. Stay. The autumn of 2024 started like any other. I was 57 years old, Shadow was 26 years into living in my shed, and our routine was as solid as the mountains surrounding us. But on September 23rd, everything I'd built over 2.5 decades began to crumble. A development company had purchased land 10 miles east of my territory. They were planning a resort, high-end, they said, eco-friendly. They needed to do environmental surveys, which meant people combing through the forest, documenting everything. The surveyors found Shadow's tracks on October 2nd, fresh ones. And these weren't people I could wave off with a story about bears. These were scientists with universities and credentials. They called in a primatologist from Oregon State University, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who'd spent 30 years studying great apes in the wild. She arrived on October 15th with a team of 6 people. They set up equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and they were thorough. Within 3 days, they documented 11 separate sets of tracks, all belonging to what Dr. Vasquez called an unknown bipedal primate of significant size. I knew it was only a matter of time before they found the shed. On October 18th, exactly 26 years to the day after I'd first found Shadow, Dr. Vasquez knocked on my cabin door. She had photographs, plaster casts of footprints, audio recordings of vocalizations, and questions. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I need you to be honest with me. Have you ever encountered anything unusual in this forest? Anything that might explain these findings?" I could have lied. I'd gotten good at lying over the years. But looking at her, at the genuine curiosity and excitement in her eyes, I couldn't. She wasn't a hunter or a sensationalist. She was a scientist who wanted to understand. "Yes," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You've seen it?" "More than seen it." I told her everything, the broken leg, the 26 years, the communication, the relationship. She listened without interrupting, her expression moving from skepticism to wonder to something like awe. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. "You're telling me you've had a Bigfoot, a living, breathing, intelligent creature, living on this property for 26 years, and you never told anyone?" "I was protecting it." "From what?" "From exactly what's happening right now, from being studied and documented and turned into a specimen." "Mr. Carter, do you understand the magnitude of what you're describing? This would be the zoological discovery of the century, maybe ever. We could learn so much." "At what cost?" I asked. "Shadow's freedom? Its safety? Its life?" "Shadow? That's what I call it." Dr. Vasquez stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the forest. "I need to see it," she said finally. "Not to capture it or hurt it, but to see it, to document its existence. Please?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "I need to talk to Shadow first." She looked at me like I was crazy, but she agreed. That night, I went to the shed. Shadow knew something was wrong. It had heard the vehicles, seen the strangers through cracks in the walls. It was agitated, pacing, making anxious sounds. "We have a problem," I told it. "People know you're here, scientists. They want to see you, to prove you exist." Shadow shook its head violently. "No, I know, but they're not going to stop. They've found your tracks. They've recorded your sounds. They're going to keep looking until they find you." "Stay," Shadow said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. "I want you to. You know I do. But I don't know if I can keep you safe anymore." Shadow sat down heavily and looked at me with those deep brown eyes. After 26 years, I could read that look. It was sadness and resignation and something else. Trust. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. Shadow reached out and touched my chest, right over my heart. Then it said something it had never said before, a word I didn't even know it knew. "Decide." So I decided. The next morning, I brought Dr. Vasquez to the shed. Just her, no team, no cameras. Her hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. Shadow was waiting inside, standing at full height. 7.5 feet tall, maybe 500 pounds, covered in that thick dark fur now streaked heavily with gray. Powerful and magnificent and absolutely terrifying to someone seeing it for the first time. Dr. Vasquez froze. I saw her legs wobble, saw her grab the doorframe for support. For a full minute, she just stared. Then Shadow did something I'll never forget. It walked forward slowly, knelt down on one knee, and held out its hand. Not in aggression, in greeting. Dr. Vasquez, to her credit, reached out and took it. Shadow's massive hand enveloped hers completely. "Hello," Shadow said. Dr. Vasquez's eyes filled with tears. "Hello," she whispered back. We spent 3 hours in that shed. Dr. Vasquez asked questions, and I translated Shadow's responses. She watched Shadow draw, listened to it speak, the 20 or so words it knew, observed the gentle intelligence in every gesture. And slowly, her scientific curiosity transformed into something deeper. Respect, maybe even protectiveness. When we finally emerged, she turned to me. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know anymore. If I report this, if I bring my team here, it will change everything. Shadow will never have privacy again. There will be cameras, recording equipment, constant observation, maybe not capture, but constant intrusion. Is that what you want?" "No, but hiding isn't working anymore either." She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "What if there was another option? What if Shadow could go somewhere else? Somewhere remote, protected, where it could live freely, but safely?" "Where?" "There are protected wilderness areas in British Columbia. Millions of acres where no development is allowed, where researchers rarely go. What if we could relocate Shadow there?" I looked at the shed, at the place where Shadow had lived for more than half my life. I don't know if Shadow would go. "Let's ask." So we did. And after I explained it, after I drew maps and showed Shadow pictures of vast forests stretching to the horizon, Shadow looked at me and said, "You come?" And there it was, the question I'd been avoiding for 26 years. "No," I said quietly. "I can't. I'm too old. It's too far. But you could find others. You could be free." "Family," Shadow said, pointing at me. "You'll always be my family. But you deserve more than hiding in a shed." Shadow was quiet for a long time. Then it touched my shoulder and said, "Okay." We left on November 3rd, 2024. Dr. Vasquez arranged everything through a conservation organization she worked with. They didn't ask questions, didn't require documentation. They just provided transport and a guide who knew the remotest areas of the Canadian wilderness. Shadow and I rode together in the back of a covered truck for 14 hours. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We'd said everything over 26 years. When we reached the drop-off point, the vastness of the forest took my breath away. Towering cedars and Douglas firs as far as I could see. No roads, no cabins, no human presence for 100 miles in any direction. Shadow stood at the tree line, looking out at its new home. Then it turned back to me. I'd prepared a speech, I'd thought about what I'd say for weeks, but when the moment came, all I could manage was, "Be safe." Shadow knelt down and pulled me into an embrace. Gentle, careful, but undeniably real. I felt the coarse texture of its fur against my face, smelled the forest scent that always clung to it, felt the solid reality of a creature that shouldn't exist, but did. "Thank you," Shadow said into my ear. Then it stood, turned, and walked into the forest. It didn't look back. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe looking back would have made it harder. I watched until I couldn't see Shadow anymore, until that massive form had become just another shadow among shadows. Dr. Vasquez put her hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing." Did I? Or did I just spend 26 years keeping something magnificent locked away because I was too afraid to let it go? "You gave it time," she said. "Time to heal, time to learn, time to become strong enough to survive out there. That's not imprisonment. That's protection." Maybe she was right. I'm still not sure. I'm telling this story now, 3 weeks after Shadow left, because I'm 60 years old and I don't have many years left to tell it, and because the world needs to know that Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, is real. Not a monster, not a myth, but a living, thinking, feeling being capable of kindness and love and loyalty. Dr. Vasquez promised to keep Shadow's location secret. She's one of only 3 people who knows this story, and she's agreed to help me tell it on the condition that certain details remain vague. No maps, no specific coordinates, just the truth, as I lived it. I moved out of the cabin last week. Couldn't stay there anymore. Every time I looked at that shed, all I saw was emptiness. I'm living with my sister now, back in civilization, trying to remember how to be around people. But every night, just after sunset, I step outside and look north, toward those Canadian forests. And I hope that somewhere out there, Shadow is free. Maybe Shadow found others. Maybe Shadow is teaching them English words and drawing pictures on cave walls. Maybe Shadow thinks about me sometimes, the way I think about it every single day. People ask me if I have regrets. The answer is complicated. I regret the isolation. I regret pushing away everyone who tried to help me after Sarah died. I regret not finding a way to share Shadow's existence sooner on terms that could have protected it while still giving the world this gift of knowledge. But I don't regret finding Shadow that night in October of 1998. I don't regret the decision to help. I don't regret 26 years of the most profound relationship I've ever experienced. Because Shadow saved me just as much as I saved it. Shadow gave me a reason to wake up every morning. Shadow gave me connection when I'd given up on connection. Shadow gave me family when I thought family was something I'd lost forever. The world is full of mysteries we've convinced ourselves don't exist. We've mapped every continent, explored every ocean, and told ourselves there's nothing left to discover. But we're wrong. There's still wonder out there, still magic, still things that defy our understanding. I've seen one of those things. I've lived with it, learned from it, loved it, in a way that transcends species and logic and everything we think we know about the natural world. Shadow taught me that intelligence comes in forms we don't expect, that communication doesn't require a shared language, that family isn't defined by blood or genetics, but by choice and sacrifice and showing up day after day, year after year. There are more shadows out there. I know this now. Shadow's drawings showed me. Those trees carved with symbols, those vocalizations echoing through the forest at night. They're there, living in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to believe. Maybe that's where they should stay. Maybe some mysteries are better left mysterious. Or maybe, someday, humanity will be wise enough to approach them with respect instead of fear, with protection instead of exploitation. I like to think Shadow is out there right now, teaching others what I taught it. How to trust, maybe. How to see humans as something other than a threat. Building a bridge between our species, one word and gesture at a time. That's my hope, anyway. My hope and my legacy. Because when I die, and it won't be too many years from now, if the doctors are right about my heart condition, I want to believe that what Shadow and I shared mattered. That it changed something, however small, in the relationship between humanity and the wild places we've spent so long trying to tame. I look back on that night in October of 1998 at the scared forest ranger with a flashlight standing before an impossible creature, and I wonder what he'd think if he knew where that moment would lead. Would he make the same choice? Would he understand the cost of protection, the weight of secrets, the profound loneliness of being the only human who knew? I think he would. I think that younger version of me, still raw with grief, desperate for purpose, would recognize what I've learned. That sometimes the most important thing we can do is protect what the world isn't ready to understand. Shadow, wherever you are, I hope you remember. I hope you know that every day I kept your secret. Every lie I told, every connection I sacrificed was worth it. You were worth it. You'll always be worth it. And maybe in whatever way your kind keeps memories, you'll tell the story too. Of the human who found you broken in the forest, who didn't run, who didn't exploit, who just offered help and in return received the gift of family. That's what I'll carry with me into whatever comes next. Not regret, not guilt, but gratitude. Gratitude for 26 years with the most extraordinary being I've ever known. Gratitude for a secret that, while heavy, was mine to keep. Gratitude for learning that love and loyalty and family can bridge any divide, even the divide between human and shadow. The world calls it Bigfoot. But I'll always call it family. I'll always call it friend. I'll always call it shadow.